Ashe, young.
Ashe.
Ashe. Oswald is blessed.
That's right.
All the time. All we do is win.
All we do is win.
Love it.
Well, they just keep marching in.
Oh, I see. So, okay, I'm trying to figure out.
Is the public here yet?
They're here.
Meaning, can they hear me?
We're here, we're live.
We're live. Welcome, everyone. My name is Robert Trent Vincent. I am very honored to be president of OSWAD and also a faculty member at the Carter G. Woodson Institute for African and African American Studies at UVA. It is a real pleasure to offer a very quick welcome. And of course, we have thank yous. First and foremost, I must thank the Woodson director, Dr. Deborah McDowell, for being very gracious in allowing the Woodson to co-host this wonderful event with OSWAD. Must thank James Perla, the technological wizard of the Woodson, who has done all the work behind the scenes to bring us together today. And of course, I must thank Bryce Henson, a member of the social media committee of OSWAD, who has been leading this effort to bring us together as well. And of course, I have to thank the rest of the social media committee. That's Taisha Maddox, Lori Lambert, Genesis Lara, Andrea Sono, and Ana Lucia Araujo, and Natanya Duncan. And when you start naming people, you always want to make sure you don't leave anybody out, but I think I got everyone. And so I want to thank that social media committee for putting together this panel and all the wonderful events that we've had throughout the year. Of course, I must thank the OSWAD board and executive officers. We have two board members here, Bryce Henson and Amber Henry, who will be one of the panelists. And of course, we must pay homage to our founding members, our founding director, Michael Gomez, as well as two of our founders who are now ancestors, Rosalind Turboyd Penn and Sterling Stuckey. And so we acknowledge our ancestors, we acknowledge our founding directors, and of course we acknowledge our past presidents. We have two here, our moderator, Leslie Alexander, who immediately preceded me, and the subject, the star of the show, the author of this wonderful article, Defining Diaspora, Refining a Discourse, Kim Butler, who preceded Leslie. So we have past presidents, we have past board members, Laura Roseanne Adderley, who's a longtime secretary. And I just want to raise you all up, Kim, Leslie, and Roseanne, because I have some inkling of how much work you all put in to build OSWAD to what it is now, this powerhouse organization. So I want to thank you all for that. It is truly a blessing. And as Kim Butler has said many, many times, and that we raise up all the time, OSWAD is truly blessed. We are blessed to be here today. And I am blessed to be witnessing this great event. And without further ado, I step aside because nobody came to hear me talk. I turn it over to Bryce Henson. Thank you.
Thank you, Brother Trent. Good afternoon, good morning. Welcome to the Association for the Study of the Worldwide African Diaspora event, Revisiting, Defining Diaspora, Refining a Discourse, Key Texts in the Study of the African Diaspora. My name is Bryce Henson. I'm an ACES Fellows at Texas A&M University. Like Trent said, I'm on the executive board and the social media committee. I cannot express how excited I am for today's webinar, which is our last event in our social media and online program. If you're unfamiliar with OSWAD, please go to our website, aswadiaspora.org, for more information. And also follow us on social media. Our handle is ASWA Diaspora on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Again, that's ASWA Diaspora. For the ever-pressing question that we all know is going to pop up on Twitter if you're responding, yes, this will be recorded and posted on our YouTube page in the upcoming weeks. And if you are tweeting during this webinar, please use the hashtags Oswald Authors and Defining Diaspora. I would like to make a few quick, give a few quick thanks, and then I'll turn it over to our moderator. First, I'd like to thank Kim Butler for agreeing to revisit her pioneering article. Like, I can't express how delightful it was when I approached her and she just enthusiastically responded yes. Also, I'd like to thank our moderator, Leslie Alexander, and our respondents, Laura Roseanne Adderley and Amber Henry, who also enthusiastically agreed to participate in this, which I think signals the importance of Kim's work broadly and this article in particular. And so I'm so grateful that as we are all battling Zoom U fatigue and exhaustion our third semester, that we are all able to come here enthusiastically to build community. Also, to kind of echo Trent's point, thank you to the Carter G. Woodson Institute for African American Studies and African Studies at UVA. The Woodson Institute are the co-hosts for today's events. In particular, I'd like to thank Robert Trent Vinson, Dr. Deborah McDowell, and James Perla for the various forms of support to put this event on. As many of us know, these events require a lot of invisible labor that goes on behind the scenes. So thank you all for the work you've done. And also, I just want to echo Trent's point about thanking the Oswald Social Media Committee, Benjamin Talton, Lori Lambert, Ana Lucia Araujo, Taisha Maddox, Natanya Duncan, Genesis Lara, Andrina Segura Soto. They are simply fantastic folks to work on this committee, and I just have the pleasure of working with them. So thank you to all that you all do in making and for help building the Oswald social media programming. Now, I will get out of the way and I will introduce our moderator. Our moderator today is Dr. Leslie Alexander, an associate professor at Arizona State University, a specialist in early African American and African diaspora history. Her research focuses on late 18th and early 19th century Black culture, political consciousness, and resistance movements. She's the author of or editor of multiple books, including her forthcoming book, which we're all excited for, Fear of a Black Republic, African Americans, Haiti, and the Birth of Black Internationalism, right? Go ahead and Google search that, see if you can pin that. A recipient of several prestigious fellowships, including the Ford Foundation Senior Fellowship, Dr. Alexander has given considerable service to the discipline. As Trent noted, she is the immediate past president of OSWAD and is also an executive council member of the National Council for Black Studies. That said, Leslie, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I just want to start by thanking both Trent and Bryce for the introductions and also for all the extraordinary work that you have done, not only to make this event happen, but also all the work that you do to keep OSWAD moving forward in beautiful and creative ways into the future. I do want to acknowledge and thank Trent in particular for his leadership. I think Kim and I are probably among the very few who understand the work that he does, and we're just grateful for everything that you do to keep building OSWAD into an extraordinary organization. I also want to thank Bryce for all the work that he did to bring this event into being. He mentioned in the introduction about how excited he was for this particular panel. And I have to say, all of the emails that he sent in advance of the event and all the work that he did to help us think through how to have this conversation. He was just, I could feel like his effervescent energy coming through the computer and all the enthusiasm that he had for this opportunity that we have to really honor and celebrate, but also I think hopefully in some interesting ways interrogate the important and really path-breaking work that Kim Butler has done in this regard. I want to jump right into the conversation as quickly as possible, but I do just want to very quickly thank again our host, OSWAD, of course, my beloved OSWAD family for bringing this event into being, and to give very special thanks to Deborah McDowell and the Carter G. Woodson Institute for African American and African Studies at the University of Virginia. I'm very grateful to the Carter G. Woodson Institute for hosting us. Every time I'm asked to moderate an event and introduce folks, what always comes to mind is Malcolm X's "Make It Plain" and keep the introductions short and sweet so that we can get to the meat of the conversation as quickly as possible. Of course, our panelists today, part of the reason why I'm so excited for this event and this conversation today is that the folks on this panel are not only extraordinary scholars and people who have given incredible service to ASWAD as an organization, but they are also incredibly dear friends and people who I just very deeply treasure having in my life. So having the opportunity to sit down and have this conversation with you really feels like an extraordinary gift to me today. So I really want to thank you for this opportunity. They are wonderful human beings in addition to being wonderful scholars. And as some of you know, that's not as common as we would always like it to be. So of course, the star, as Trent said earlier, the star of our show today is Kim Butler, who of course is a former president of ASWAD, but is also associate professor at Rutgers University. We are joined by Roseanne Adderley, who's a former secretary of ASWAD and associate professor at Tulane University. And I'm excited to announce we also have Amber Henry with us, who is an ASWAD board member. And she has given us, the reason I'm excited is that she has given us permission to announce that this fall she will be a visiting professor of anthropology and Africana studies at Haverford College. So congratulations, Amber. Haverford is going to be very lucky to have you. I want to jump right into some questions. And of course, I'm going to direct my first question or two towards Kim, and then I'm going to bring Roseanne and Amber into the conversation to have us talk through this article a bit. I also want to let the participants, the viewers, know that after we engage in a bit of conversation with each other, we're also going to open it up to questions from you. So as you are listening along, if you have a burning question, please feel free to submit it through the question and answer. I can see every now and then I'm peeking over at the chat and I can see that folks are having a lively, active discussion over there, which is wonderful and we encourage. But when you have an actual question that you would like the panelists to consider, please submit it through the Q&A so that we can see it more quickly and clearly. So the first question I want to ask for you, Kim, is a little bit about the moment. It's hard to believe it's been 20 years. When Bryce first sent me an email about this, I was like, I love talking about Kim's work, but like, it's been 20 years since this article was published. It was hard to imagine that 2 decades have passed since this, as Trent said, this pioneering article was published. But what really strikes me about that is that the article was published at a particular moment in the development of African diaspora studies as a field. We're in a very different place now, 20 years later. But I wanted you to reflect a little bit on that moment, on what was happening in your mind in African diaspora studies 20 years ago when you were working on this article. You may also want to connect it to, what was also happening in Atlantic World Studies, in Black studies, but in particular in the development of African diaspora studies. What was sort of the context that shaped the moment when you wrote this article, and what were some of the questions and debates that you were really wanting to engage?
Okay, well, thank you so much for this, Leslie. And I can't start answering your question without also voicing my most sincere appreciation to everybody. I know that we have named everyone and I don't want to, take too much time away, but I cannot go forward without expressing my sincere thanks to ASWAD, to the Carnegie Woodson Institute, to the amazing committees that have put this together, to so much to make this happen. I always give thanks to everybody who has given so much of themselves. And I see all these folks in the room right now on a Friday afternoon in April, when everybody's been blinded by Zoom for months, and that you all are here. I see a lot of people who are very dear to me. And so thank you all for being here. And thank you just for, being on this journey. And one thing you said, Trent, also in terms of, and this kind of is going to help me answer your question, Leslie, about the people that we are honoring. You just mentioned two people who were very formative in terms of creating this moment that really helped diaspora studies explode, which is Rosalind Terborg Penn, and of course, Sterling Stuckey, who was a mentor to many of us. And I would just like to add to that Colin Palmer, who was also one of the people who was very, very instrumental in this. And as a matter of fact, it was in 1998 that he published his article on the different phases in historicizing the African diaspora in perspectives for the AHA, because I believe it was the 1999 AHA meeting that put diasporas as the theme. And it was an important moment because I came into graduate school in the late 80s. And at that time, I decided to go to Howard because I wanted to study with Joseph Harris. And as we all know, you had that first big conference in 79 at Howard, but it hadn't yet really translated into systemic diaspora majors and programs and concentrations. So that was still kind of formative. I mean, even though I was there at Howard, they told me, there is no diaspora or anything. You were in Latin American studies because I was doing Brazil. So this was very common around. But then I think that as we started getting like a little later into the late 90s, it was just exploding. It was really exploding. And there was so much being published on the diaspora. I will also mention Ruth Sims had begun her African diaspora research program at MSU. And that was also very formative. So you had a lot of people beginning to think about it. You had and right then you had the Collins article, you had the AHA, and then you come up with Aswad. And Aswad was I cannot tell you how transformative that was, because it was really the first major conference since that 79 conference to bring together a generation later, a whole set of other scholars. And from that point on, it was just off to the races. So much stuff was being done. The empirical work was just going gangbusters. So that was the moment. In terms of why I really felt the need to write it, it came from that experience of being in graduate school with all of these, studies, but I couldn't really wrap my hand around, what was this, all the nuances of diaspora. And I kept looking to see what it was. So in a sense, I was sort of writing this to my graduate school self. Yeah. And, I look at it now and I'm like, oh my Lord, I was so pedantic. It must have this, that, but I just needed some clarity. Mm-hmm. And the last thing I'll say right now is that, and I don't think we will really appreciate this so much now, but there were a lot of people, diaspora studies was so deeply associated with the Jewish diaspora. Yes. And a lot of people in Jewish diaspora studies were like debating whether or not there was even an African diaspora. They were talking about there was a slave diaspora and there's maybe this and that, but they were like, we don't think y'all are a diaspora. And, so in some way, I was kind of having this conversation with them because that was the way in which everybody was defining diaspora based on this Jewish prototype. Mm-hmm. And so, that's some of the I won't say too much right now, but this was a lot of the inspiration for me to get into this.
Yeah. Thank you. I want to bring Roseanne and Amber in and have them talk a little bit about their initial reactions when they first encountered the article. But I just very quickly want to ask you a follow-up question about what you just said, because part of what you were just describing was like rapid movement that was happening, sort of all of a sudden an explosion of activity around African diaspora studies. And when I was revisiting your article in preparation for this event, there was an expression that really jumped out at me. And on page 190, you talked about how we all needed, you were essentially urging us to, the quote is, to catch our breath before moving on, which maybe jumped out at me because it felt really Kim Butler to me. But it also was like, yeah, it reminded me kind of a sense of frenzy that was happening in that moment. And I was just hoping you could say, just, talk just a bit about why you felt like it was so important that we take a moment, that we take a pause for the cause and catch our breath before we kind of continue to sort of move on.
Right. Well, the one little piece I did forget to mention that had come out and was affecting a lot of folks was Black Atlantic. Paul Gilroy's Black Atlantic had come out. And I think for a lot of, in some circles, it was sort of becoming a stand-in for what we were doing. And all the people who were involved in African diaspora studies from the beginning, they were clear that it wasn't just the Atlantic world. Joe Harris was a scholar, an Africanist who specialized in the Indian Ocean and India, Africans in India. So I think that there was a way in which people were beginning to critique African diaspora studies for having this overly Atlantic focus. And I mean, granted, that is where a lot of the scholarship does exist, but they were beginning to critique it and say, well, it was, there were shortcomings in the conceptualization of diaspora based on all these different ways in which people were understanding it. And what I was, and I still am concerned with, I don't want people to say, you know what, diaspora just doesn't work. I think that it's so useful for any of us who are concerned about African people working in collaboration together. How to get there requires an understanding of all the nuances of our distinctions. And to just simply go forward and say, we're not going to really be attentive to how this works and how these communities shape out and how we, get through the disjunctures, then that to me is not taking advantage of a tool. And the other thing I want to say too is that some people seem to be concerned that African diaspora would be a replacement for things like Pan-Africanism or things like Black studies or African American studies. There were all these ways in which people were talking about it. And for me, it was just an additional resource available to us that, there's so many kinds of questions we can ask when we study Black experience. Not every single study is a diaspora study. It doesn't need to be, right? You don't have to do that. And so that was something else I was trying to speak to.
Yeah. Thank you. Actually, you're taking me a little bit down memory lane because I had actually forgotten, about some of the sort of panic and fear that took place about what would, the real establishment of African diaspora studies mean, for all these other areas. What would it mean for Black studies or all these different fields? So I think that's a really powerful and important point. I want to have us eventually get to think through a little bit, how we see the field has evolved, right? And what has actually happened over the past 20 years since your article came out. But I just want to take one more question, having us on memory lane, talking a little bit about the moment when the article came out. By having Roseanne and Amber talk a little bit about your first encounter with the article and what your reflections were upon it. It obviously, it's actually really rare, I think, in this day and age for an article to have such an incredibly significant impact on a field. You know, we tend to be in disciplines that are very book focused and book motivated. And certainly your monographs have also been incredibly influential, Kim, but this is an article that really did play a significant role, as the title indicates, in defining our field. So maybe I'll start with you, Roseanne. If you could say a little something about how and when you first encountered and read Defining Diaspora, and what your first impressions were. Oh, you need to unmute.
I was going to, I will take one point of tech. If people cannot hear me, let me know, because I'm having some internet problems and I have some backup solutions in front of me.
Okay, you're good,
I'll plead middle age. I don't remember exactly when I encountered this article, but I do remember something quite specific about it. I have so many favorite passages, but I think my favorite passage is on 193, which I shall not read, which is about how the caution against acting as if African diaspora is this capacious identity that can explain everything, and it wanders us through the connections of a hypothetical Jamaican migrant. And in my own subject position as an immigrant from the Bahamas to this country, but also someone who was raised under colonialism and raised by very progressive teachers that talked to us a lot about what it meant, and this was in the 70s, about what it meant to be a part of a global community. But I entered sort of graduate school with a subject position. I can take no intellectual credit for it. I was in some ways raised by the children of Garveyites. I have 4 Garvey grandparents on either side at different class levels. But I got to graduate school, and as someone working on the later years of the Atlantic slave trade, and I was super interested, not shilling for my own work, but I was super interested in the ending of the slave trade and what those Africans of the 19th century were up to in terms of making identity. And when I was a graduate student, I got endless questions because Kim says in the article that in her own work, she's dealt with the sort of the self-conscious uses of identity and how people understand that. And that was very much where I was coming from. If you had the good fortune, and I use that loosely, if you're the African who ended up on a slave ship that wasn't enslaved, or what are you doing with that identity if you claim, an identity? I got endless questions as a graduate student in the late 90s from people who studied modern immigration and modern migration. And I don't know whether it was the environment I was in at the University of Pennsylvania that had at the time an extremely strong and active graduate group in demography with a lot of people that studied migration, but they were very concerned with what these sort of contemporary late 20th century migrants did with identity. And I got these questions shoving me to the social science literature about migration. And I would go to it obediently as a reasonably obedient grad student, and I never found anything that intellectually captured what I was thinking about, because even in the 19th century, and I do want to talk about the self-conscious positionality of our historical subjects with regard to this question of diaspora, but I never found anything in the migration studies that helped me. It informed me, but not anything that was really grappling with the framework that I think was meaningful, not just to those of us trying to study diasporas, but I think particularly often to historical subjects who were thinking about, their positionality with respect to other people displaced from the homeland which they claimed. Like the sort of, and I don't want to turn all migration studies into something overly linear, but my first encounter with this article was at a deeply painful moment, and one that I still resent. I never found anything in the migration literature that helped me. And I finished that dissertation in 1996. The book came out 10 years later, but it was right about 2001 that I was like, stop reading, cut it out, stop reading, edit this damn thing, make a book. This is what the career requires of you. People are constantly, and I read this after that point when I made the commitment. And I have this very I wouldn't say there's something weak about the conclusion, but in my conclusion, I have a little bit of shade and saltiness about, God, no one's theorizing this in a way that helps me. And in fact, well before my book came out, someone did, but I put myself off of looking to it. And I didn't, and for that reason, I found it an incredibly powerful article. All right, in that sense, that precisely at the moment that all of this sort of diaspora work, as y'all have already said, was exploding, we didn't have, all right, and Kim in this article drew together what we did have and suggested why the ways in which it both serves, particularly those of us in African diaspora studies, and sort of more broadly, and that there's endless, if the volume of theorizing about migration, what we need, I think, is an equal volume of theorizing about diaspora. And in some ways, I am shocked that it hasn't yet happened. It's hard. It's incredibly difficult. The second, so that was my initial encounter and I'm not sure, and I think we should think about like how would our work, sort of in African diaspora studies and other diaspora studies, be strengthened by having more of such pedantic or no, of such theoretical engagement. I will say, and this is my sort of, the second part of my encounter was that this article came out in the early 2000s, which was I was at the front end of an academic career. And one of the things that in fact surprised me was that 10% of the inquiries at what was often shorthanded in an African and diaspora studies department, because they didn't want to name it, was too long, was that the presumption was if you said African and diaspora studies, it was a program, not a department, must be clear, that if you said African and diaspora studies, it would be understood that what your specialty was in the African diaspora. But roughly 10% of the inquiries were people inquiring either about Jewish diaspora studies or about diaspora studies theoretically, like meaning both inquiries from students, from graduate students, from people who wondered if we had an events calendar, which gets to sort of the second point that I think this article draws out that I think we underestimate, that this idea is meaningful in the world. It's not an intellectual construct that a bunch of academics are arguing about. That the very fact that they were literal by having the diaspora studies on our name, as opposed to say being African and African American studies, it never occurred to me that would provoke a set of external inquiries, and it did. And I think that was, so those were my two initial encounters with the article and its importance. And I'd be interested in Kim or others' take on why we haven't had, a wheelbarrow. Like you've got a ton of articles theorizing migration, but we don't, yet have, this didn't provoke in some ways what I, thought it might. So I will stop there.
Yeah, thank you, Roseanne. And actually, I think we will get to that because what you just raised at the end was, something I definitely want us to make sure we talk about today, is a reflection on kind of where we are now and perhaps, as you suggested, why we haven't seen, right, the proliferation of theory on this subject that we might have otherwise seen. Amber, can you talk a little bit about your first encounters with this article?
Certainly. So first, thank you to Oswald, to everyone here, Leslie, Kim Butler, to the folks at the Carter G. Woodson Institute as well. Thanks for being here. So I encountered Kim Butler's Defining a Discipline in, I guess, 2008, 2009, when I was a student at Rutgers University. I took 2 classes with Kim, Africana Studies, and also, of course, on the African diaspora. But it resonated with something that was in me, and it really kind of put a language to something that I was feeling growing up between Brooklyn, New York, and being in different parts of the diaspora myself. So there's a moment that my father always brought me to, and it's a moment when Nelson Mandela is released from prison in 1988. And he commented that in Brooklyn, a lot of his, Black and folks from diaspora, whether from the continent of Africa or Jamaica or Barbados, different places in South the US, that there was a comment when someone saw Nelson being released from prison the comment was, why didn't he wear African clothing, right? And I always remember this, and I just wanted to hail my father. I see he's amongst the participants, so hi, Dad. But what's interesting about this and what Kim Butler's article gave me language to really understand was this notion of the construct of Africa, right? What my father was speaking about in that moment was the ways in which folks in the US and other parts of the diaspora were unsatisfied with the way Africa was being represented because it wasn't their version of Africa, right? Because it wasn't, kind of signaled with the African garb. And I will, Roxanne, quote one of my favorite passages from the article, and that is about the construct of the homeland. So Kim says, the construct of the homeland is essential. It functions as a constituting basis of a collective diasporan identity. It is a homeland that anchors diasporan identity. That's on 204. And then on 206, she goes on to say, and I love this, to some extent, diasporan representations of the homeland are part of the project of constructing diasporan identity rather than the homeland actually, right? And that really resonated for me as an undergrad, and it still does to this day, because it calls us to think about the uses of Africa, right? Or the uses of homeland, to speak more generally in diasporic terms. What is it that the homeland is animated to do for folks who are distant from it and who have no other way of connecting via physical displacement than to kind of conjure up the homeland, right? And that's why I really love Kim Butler's addition to the characteristics of how to study diaspora, right? So she says that there are a number of scholars who agree on at least 3 principal characteristics of what a diaspora should be, right? So there has to be displacement to 2 or more places, there has to be a relationship to a homeland, and also this concept of self-awareness. But then she says, there's something that we're missing, right? And what we're missing at that is that we need to have multiple generations. And that's important because if folks are displaced and then are able to return without creating multiple generations, we miss the idea of homeland, right? We miss the usefulness of the construction of longing and a separation that's both temporal and historical, and needing to create something to connect us and to allow us to survive in the absence of being able to return. And that something is diaspora in this case, right? So I really connected and resonated with this. So I really want to think about what we can do with diaspora. And I was thinking, as I encountered this piece, I re-encountered it because it was assigned as required reading from my African Intro to Africana course this semester. But what I'm thinking about is what is it that diaspora can tell us, right? So I think in discovering this piece, especially in a class titled African Diaspora, we were thinking, okay, Black people are everywhere, right? But what this article really asks us to consider is, what is it that Black people being everywhere can tell us, right? What can it tell us about the flows of global capital? What can it tell us about the flows of labor and migrants? What can it tell us about, to quote Lisa Lowe's book, the intimacies of 4 continents, right? What can diaspora really do? And I love this because at the time, as an undergrad, really embarking in Black studies, I was told so much that, like, right, but Africana studies, but Black studies is this silo, right? You're just in a cave, kind of speaking to each other. It's not research, it's me search. Black people are researching Black people. That's what's important. But what this piece really inspires us to do is say, no, diaspora studies is instructive for the entire world, right? There is something particular about this form of community formation that allows us to understand more deeply humanity and the flows of people across space and time.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Amber. It was so interesting to listen to your response for many reasons, but one, because again, as I was reflecting on this article recently, what also really resonated for me, really jumped out at me, was that section about the construction of the homeland. And it's interesting that you were talking about just now the way that resonated with you. It's making me wonder, like, is there something happening in this moment right now, right, that's really making that sing to us right now? I'm going to, in a couple of moments, open it up and welcome questions from our participants. The time is actually moving far more quickly than I thought it was going to be, and I definitely want to give folks who are listening an opportunity to respond, but I'm going to try to sneak in a couple of other questions quickly before we allow other folks to chime in. Kim, I want us to think and talk a little bit about where you feel like, what you feel like has happened in the past 20 years. You know, when you think about, we've been talking about the moment when you first wrote the article, and I'm just interested in your thoughts about, you know, what you feel like has changed, you know, what you feel like the evolution is that has actually taken place over the past 20 years. And I guess I'm just like curious in particular, you and I have known each other forever, and I don't think this is a question I've ever asked you, is, you know, how has your thinking about diaspora evolved or changed since you wrote this article? And, you know, what are, to the extent that it has changed or evolved, what is it that you think has motivated those changes? Like, who are the other thinkers? What are the other kind of developments that have taken place that have shaped your thinking?
Oh my gosh, that's such a big set of
I
questions.
know. You're welcome.
You know, I maybe I could say it this way, that I think of it more, not so much that my thinking on diaspora has changed, but I continue to be like the biggest geek when it comes to diaspora. I mean, I can sit there and just play with, like, you know, these little things. And so much of the recent scholarship has just been fascinating in terms of what it allows us to think about. So, you know, for example, and let me just say one thing about what you just said, Amber, in terms of sort of the larger implications. One shift, you know, everybody was so concerned about how they, you know, their diaspora is related to the Jewish diaspora and all this. And I think that I am really, there's been so much empirical work done that I know I can just sit with African diaspora studies, and we have so much complexity, so much intricacy into the ways in which we live transnationally across space and time, that you can come and really work out everything there is to know about diaspora just by studying the African diaspora. We are the ones that I think stand to inform everybody else about how this exists as a form of human community. The second thing I would say, in terms of just some of the things that have come out, there's been a lot of emphasis on processes. And I say that to say that, you know, a lot of times we kind of go back and forth between it, talking about the African diaspora as a thing, a community, and the processes, the relationships between people, which is where diaspora happens, you know, this working out. I see a couple of people bigging up Brooklyn. and I will say that, you know, everybody from Brooklyn, you know, you can't stop Brooklyn people. Anyway, but yes, Amber and I actually are from 2 blocks apart from each other. And I grew up in a time when Brooklyn was known as the People's Republic, because it had some of the largest African diaspora populations from all over the world. I mean, we have like the largest Garifuna of population, for example, from Central America, very well represented. Yes, well, obviously, you know, you have your big 3 islands, you know, Jamaica, Trinidad, Barbados, but now Guyana, you know, the list goes on. And I say that because one of the things that is so important is the ways in which all of these people who come from different backgrounds and different locations, and particularly also, you know, this sense that Thomas Holt talks about of overlapping diasporas. So you've got your new African immigrants mixing with the Caribbean immigrants, mixing with the people who've been here for 400 years, you know, and all of us together constitute a Black community that is indistinguishable to, you know, police and educators and grantors and loan officers. We're indistinguishable in that way. But we see those differences and we come together in spaces. Like I have a wonderful new colleague, Akisi Britton, who is doing some fascinating work on people coming together in sacred spaces, you know, in religious communities. It's these little points where we see the ways in which people work out. And one of the, I always have to thank Brent Edwards. He came up with a beautiful phrase for this. He borrowed from the French décalage, which I never was good in French, but it talks about like that sort of articulation between two joints that allows it to work together. So if you imagine like a knee, it's got the two different parts, but it's those ligatures, those places, and sometimes it has to be apart in order to move together. And that concept, I think, is really helpful. So a lot of the work that people are doing today are on all these little ways in which we see diaspora working itself out. And that opens up to me a lot in terms of enriching our scholarship on diaspora. I will say this also, there's been a lot of exciting work about our, you know, this relationship between the African homeland and abroad. On the social science side, there's a whole lot of work being done on remittances, you know. But then you've got people like our own Aswad, former executive board, our officer, Bio Halsey, who did work on, actually two former officers. We got Bio Halsey working on Ghana and Jemima Pierre working on Ghana and talking about, you know, all the ways in which people try to sort these things out between themselves. And this relationship to homeland, it's complex. It's very complex. Yes. And it doesn't need to take place in the homeland. A lot of that relationship, you know, like you just mentioned, Amber, happens right where we are. So in terms of, and the other thing, one other thing I would say that I think is going to be really important is our study of digital. You know, what does the digital do for our ways of being in diaspora? And I know that there are a lot of people. Hey, another Oswald, let me big up another Oswald person. I mean, I'm thinking about Abasedi George did this project on, you know, the sort of collective history of people who were descendants of Lagos. I mean, there's just so much. I mean, I feel now like Trent that if I start naming some people, then I'm going to leave other people out. But I just think that there's our empirical work over the last 20 years has opened up incredible space for us to continue to refine this concept. And one of the things that Ruth Sims Hamilton always really emphasized is that at the end of the day, we can write our own theory. We do not need to be dependent on borrowing from everybody else's theory. We can write our own. And so I really encourage people who, you know, are so inclined, continue this work. Yeah.
Thank you, Kim. I love that analogy that you have, right, about what it takes, needing for things to be apart sometimes in order for them to move forward. I love that. Amber, it looked like you had something you wanted to
yeah, I just wanted to jump in. Kim, you're bigging up other people, but you yourself have a metaphor for this interconnecting mechanism in your piece. So on page 208, Kim gives us the metaphor of the wheel, right? So she says that the physical scattering can be represented by the hub of a wheel connected to its various. Diaspora is the interconnecting ideology that completes the wheel, linking the spokes to each other as well as to the center, thus creating the whole of this transnational community. And I think that's what's so unique about diaspora is its emphasis on the relationships of the different spokes to one another, not only to the center, right? And Kim, just to talk about what you just mentioned, this idea of coming back and relating to one another. Where I work in Colombia, specifically the community of San Basilio de Palenque, in Cartagena, there have been interactions between Palenqueros with African Americans. And I think that here, this issue of travel noir and Black travel is really interesting to think about these simultaneous kind of conjurings of diaspora between Black folks from, say, the US or Europe, Black folks in diaspora communities in the Americas, and then also Africans who are coming, in the case of Palenque, from Cameroon and from Angola, and participating in the production of documentaries, music, intellectual spaces, all around this notion of diaspora.
Yeah. And you know, oh, Roseanne got her hand. Let me just say one little quick thing. But that piece was not a piece that was, you know, thing about like, everybody was talking about the relationship of diaspora to the homeland, but not so much about our relationships to each other, which has been so important. So I'll just say, but yeah.
This is all about you, Kim, today. You can talk whenever you want. And we will just sit here and
no, it's a collective. It's a collective.
Roseanne, what did you want to say?
No, I actually wanted to pick up on something that Amber had said. Because that's one of the notes that I made to myself in thinking about today. I have a colleague, Angel Adams-Parham, who writes on a lot of things, but her early work was actually, her early 2000s work on how greater capacity for travel and greater technology was actually changing and enhancing the relationship both of diaspora to homeland, but also to itself. And I was wondering about Kim's thinking on that. So the kind of things she looked at, like what did it mean, particularly with electronic communication, that say, for example, a Haitian diaspora in Canada is now in much better contact with both Haiti and with people in France and people in the US, and how does that affect the making of community? And the other sort of, and you know, to Amber's point about travel, like the scale of even touristic travel, you know, in Viola Holsey's work and Amber's work to these locations to engage, we can do things in that diaspora that we like in terms of our relationships to it and to homeland, to one another, that even were only just becoming possible when this work, you know, came out.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and that's, and I'm wondering if that sort of gives more hope for us thinking in the capacious way that Kim calls for, about particularly the relationships between different parts of the diaspora. But also, this is very much, this article is about how people think of themselves and how one crafts both an ethno-national identity, how one crafts an identity, a self-conscious identity as a part of the diaspora. But if you now have the opportunity to nurture that crafting by voluntary travel or by kind of internet discourse, one of the more interesting projects in my own work, it's not my work, but it's in sort of slave trade studies where you get into these, you actually, one of the things that all the database people now do is they ask contemporary residents in Africa, like, I'm looking at this fragment of document with this set of names, and they're like, oh my God, you know, those names, you know, that's like, and trying to start a set of conversations that are radically different from what was possible, say at the, you know, even 20 years ago. And I wonder, you know, sort of, I was wondering about Kim's thinking on how that nurtures this capacious understanding of diaspora.
Yeah. Well, you know, thank you so much for that, Roseanne. And let me go back and big up Colin Palmer again, because, and maybe just the profession of history, because we always historicize everything. But it does make a difference. I mean, what is going on now is going just by leaps and bounds. And I think this is the reason why I think it's also a good case for intergenerational work, because in this, I think those of us who are scholars really need to be listening to young people, because young people are doing things that are, I mean, okay, I just found out, you know, because you do have to talk to some young folks. There's this thing going on now on Twitch, which I had to be instructed on what Twitch was, but Twitch is a platform, and now they have these like DJ, not battles, but they just take this turn like DJing Caribbean music. And so I'm listening to the one guy who is broadcasting from his basement in Brooklyn, and he's like, he's going to put it off next to the guy in Manchester and somebody, I mean, they're all over the planet. somebody is, oh yeah, okay, so yeah, so Roseanne's in the chat asking me about Twitch. Yeah, no, but and I think that that's good. That's healthy for our research, because our research should never be produced entirely from the ivory tower. I mean, our research is very much, I know Amber is very on the ground, you know, as an anthropologist, she is with people all the time, but all of us are with people all the time. And diaspora is very much a lived reality for all of us. You know, I mean, you can just, I mean, diaspora could be on your dinner plate tonight, you know, depending on how you decide that you're going to cook your dinner. We've all shared with each other. And so I just think that that is what's going to happen in the next couple of years as the digital technology continues to move at the lightning pace it does, is going to be really important for us to be attentive to.
Yet it affects people's subjectivity in a way that, like, people are talking about the quote unquote effects of the internet in ways that are important, but it affects people's self-understanding. And I think ways that we are just scratching the surface of.
So people in the chat are appreciating your reminder that diaspora may be on our dinner plates tonight, which I love too.
I know that this is not highfalutin, you know, what do you call it, conceptualization, but I happen to be a big fan of the show Top Chef. And I just noticed, like, yesterday they did a whole thing on the diaspora in food and really saying, you know, hey, all you fancy chefs, you need to pay attention to African traditions of food. And the two chefs that they had on were walking people through the cuisines of Guyana and West Africa, you know, just different places. And I was just like getting feelings, because, because, you know, it is time for us to all appreciate the vibrancy and importance, you know, to all of our cultures, because the story of the African diaspora is essential to the story of modernity. You cannot understand our world if you do not understand the African diaspora. And we touch so many aspects of the way we live today. So yeah, I just had to.
Absolutely.
I would say, Kim, I work in New Orleans, and we had a huge blow up here because a fancy restaurant that does, and a very fancy one, a quite posh one, put up a Black Lives Matter. And of course, predictably, white people with some money in their pockets who patronize the restaurant said, what are you bringing that in here? And the proprietor, he basically said what you just said. He says, dear racist people complaining about my sign, if you are consuming this food, not just in this New Orleans place, but if you are consuming what modern culture has made in the way we live our culinary lives, to pretend that somehow I've brought up some other thing is not just about slavery in this city. It is actually about the making of the modern culture that you claim to appreciate. And you cannot have it both ways. Mm-hmm. And it was a profound moment. And people wondered why it went viral. And people asked me, I said, oh no, it went viral because it's way more important than, you know, a local dispute over politics. And it was a very powerful thing that he had said, but also about the way that people, and it is the way that anti-Black racism works, that people ignore that truth.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So it's hard to believe, but we only have like maybe 15 minutes left. So I want to invite people at this point to submit questions through the Q&A feature, and we're going to try to get to as many of your questions as we can. As the questions begin to roll in, I just want to ask each of you, and again, we want to make time for questions, so try to keep, you know, your responses as brief as possible. But I just am interested in, for those of you who don't know Kim personally, there are, for me, a lot of things about this article that remind me of all of the things that I love about her spirit in general. And one of them that really jumps out is that Kim has an extraordinary generosity of spirit. And one of the things that is really generous, I think, in this article is that Kim, you actually go out of your way to not be the definitive and last word, right, on how diaspora ought to be theorized. And you actually really go out of your way to encourage other people to continue the conversation. So Kim, I'd like to start by hearing from you a little bit about where you're hoping that the conversation is going to continue to go in the future. And then maybe Roseanne and Amber, you could say, you're welcome to answer that as well, like where you'd like to see the scholarship to go, but maybe you could also say a little something about how this article has specifically influenced your work.
Okay, well, I'll make it quick, and I don't want it to seem flip, but I think that is why, that's the beauty of opening it up to other people, because you never know what they're going to come up with. They can come up with something that you would have never, ever thought about. I just encourage people to do it. And in that, I literally am passing on the gift that was passed to me to say that we can do this. And, you know, the other thing that Ruth Hamilton she was the first. Well, anyway, I said I was going to not make it too long, but I always like to say, you know, we get PhDs, right? I'm a doctor of history. I don't have a PhH or I mean, a H, whatever it is. I'm not a doctor of history. We are doctors of philosophy. We are supposed to think creatively and think about how the work that we do speaks to larger questions, right? So I think that regardless of whatever field that we are in, we all have the capacity, because when, you know, the big thing when I was in graduate school, everybody kept telling me, read Antonio Gramsci. That was the big thing. Everybody, I was like, you know, after fighting them, I said, okay, all right, I do want to get this degree and get out of here. So let me go read Antonio Gramsci. And I was like, wait a minute. All he did was observe some Italian peasants and write about what he was theorizing about them. So why can't we do the same thing? Why can't we look at our people and make our own theory about them? And so that's what I just encourage, that instead of, you know, being forced to parrot, I mean, obviously, if you want to get out and get finished, you do have to say that you know them, but know them, cite them, and then keep on going to what you really need to do, which is your own contribution. And we are a people of genius. We are people of creativity. We think all kinds of outside the box. And so let us bring that into scholarship in our full, you know, we are mature now in this field. Let us claim that and let us go ahead on and write the epistemology of this field. You know, we are not only about just bringing in the stories, but thinking about the stories and making it speak to this larger community that we have. And that's just what I encourage, however that may be. It might become, because the other thing is that it is so complex, is that it might require new forms of thinking and writing and researching, completely new approaches that the ivory tower has not been prepared for. So that too, you know, our methodology. So, you know, just encourage everybody's contribution on that.
I love that. I love that. Thank you, Kim. Amber, do you want to say a little something on this?
Sure. Just this idea of kind of taking up and continuing. Two things that I am engaging in my own work are the notions of homeland and how that is kind of shared. So I just want to share a couple photographs from my own work real quick. I have videos, but I don't think we have time. So this is Palenque. This is San Basilio de Palenque in Colombia, where over the past 5 years or so, graffiti has been put up specifically connecting Black Palenqueros with African Americans, right? So a Black Lives Matter wall in Palenque. I love being Black painted on the wall in Palenque also. And there's been an influx of Black American tourists traveling specifically to Palenque and engaging in this notion of homeland and kind of African retentions. So that is absolutely a factor in thinking about how these spaces are conjured up, but also the usefulness of diaspora as a common ground, right? I think that one of the things that diaspora gives us is the ability to start conversations from a place of commonality, even if it just serves as a point of departure to then look at the idiosyncrasies and things that kind of really nuance these different communities. And then finally, I want to bring up this idea of these kind of embodied encounters with cultural ambassadors from the continent itself. So in 2019, something really cool happened. There were two African filmmakers from Cameroon and from Angola. This is Bekolo, and this is Wilfrido, and this is Kai, who is a Ghanaian descendant living in London. So Cameroon, Angola, London with Ghanaian descent, and then myself from Brooklyn, and spent a lot of time in Colombia. So with these African citizens coming to diasporic communities, there's this kind of embodied encounter with the continent, and people jointly participate in the construction of what Africa is, what it's not, and what it, how that notion of homeland is different for people who are in the diaspora vis-a-vis folks who have remained on the continent. So I'll stop there because I would really love to hear from some of the conference participants.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Roseanne, we do have some questions that are coming in, but if you just want to have, if you would like to add to this, we'd love to hear from you too.
I will keep it short because there's so much this article teaches us. I think the most important thing, it gets to something, Leslie, you said, I don't have a brain for theory, I have a brain for other things. But what I love about this article is its self-consciousness about the thinking through. And that is actually the way to write theory. And it is, and I think it's something that is lost on the ivory tower, but because of the class and oppression consciousness that comes out of Black diaspora studies, that is where Kim Butler's ethics live, but it's where that article is written from. And if we walk with that, the money part of the article is on the bottom of 2.5. I worship that. So it's, and it is at the Carter G. Woodson Institute, postdoctoral fellow, where I learned to be clearer and briefer in my answers. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. So I am going to turn to the questions that are flowing in, and I'm going to take them in order that they came in. Our dear Aswad friend, Yvonne Captain, has asked a question that I think is primarily just interested in your reflections on, Kim, whether you feel like we're gaining ground in the field. She's essentially saying, 20 years ago, you asked us not just what we wanted to add to the research, but how it really fits into the study of the field. And so she's interested to know, if you feel like we're gaining ground in that regard. Oh, wait, you have to unmute.
Yeah. No, it's so nice to hear from Yvonne. So thank you so much for that. I think I don't know, that one, it's tough. I personally think that I would really encourage, like I said, just more and more Aswad are very involved in this. We like to do this, but just sort of across the board, I just would really encourage, additional, because I think about, if you think about, for example, the field of women's studies, right? They really were conscious about putting in that epistemological work. For example, they appear in like a lot of places, like a lot of the introductions on anthologies or special issues, they get into this. So that's the kind of thing that I think is really moving the field forward. So it's out there. And I think that if we can just kind of really work through bringing all these things together, we are advancing it. And I just think that, for example, places like Aswad are so important for keeping that ball rolling. So thanks a lot for that question, Yvonne.
Thank you. So we also have a question from someone who submitted anonymously, who was interested, I think, in having you talk through a little bit about who is included in the conception of diaspora. And it's pointing out, as we talked about before, a little bit earlier in the discussion today, that you were talking about the importance of multiple generations in defining diaspora. So the question from our participant is, in your view, does that mean that recent immigrants from Africa are also part of the diaspora, or would it be their children
Right.
who qualify?
This is the kind of thing that I could sit around and have like a cup of coffee and sit around and toss around for a long time. Paul Zaleza says that really diaspora begins with that second generation. I'm not so sure. I do understand what he's saying. And that's why I said these are the kind of things that are questions to sit with. And sometimes we don't give ourselves enough time, because at the same time, you definitely have, for example, women from East Africa, Libya, right, to do work. They're having there's this whole movement there. You've got all the people going to Europe right now, and they are definitely dealing with a lot of things. I mean, they're being welcomed by communities that have been there. They are confronting people like the soccer fans who throw, banana peels at people. Their presence impacts the people who are there already. The people who have lived, for example, in Italy for a little while are going to be experiencing their lives as Black people differently because of the presence of these folks there. So all of these things come to bear. And then there's always the question of their relationship to the places that they come from, because they do have a very real relationship to the places that people who are leaving now come from. And it's not just from Africa. There's secondary migrations too. I mean, anybody who knows the Caribbean knows that that's a whole nother circularity of diasporic relationships within the African diaspora. And then, you've got all the movements that are happening that are contained within the continent itself. So for me, I do think that migrants, people who travel, are definitely part of it, but they're not the only part. It's multidimensional. So that's just sort of how I see that one.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kim. Unfortunately, we have some more questions coming in that I know that we don't. I know that at least a couple of the panelists need us to end on time. So I'm sorry that we're not going to be able to get to all of the questions. It's a reminder of the fact that these are the kinds of conversations we need to be having, that people are itching to participate. But I really want to thank all of the participants who came and submitted questions and who participated in such a lively way in the chat. It was just exciting to see so many people's names pop up and to know that you were with us today. I also want to again thank OSWAD for hosting us, and a special thank you to the Carter G. Woodson Institute for hosting us. I want to give a special thanks to Trent and Bryce for making all of this happen and bringing it into fruition. And I really want to thank Roseanne and Amber for participating and for sharing their thoughts. And Kim, I don't even know what to say. Like I get emotional when I think about you for so many reasons, but want to thank you for your extraordinary work and your extraordinary scholarship. But also just want to thank you for the beautiful gift of your friendship and your sisterhood, and for all that you bring not only to the work that you do, but what you have given to OSWAD, and for all that you have given to the lives of those of us who are lucky to call you friends. So thank you so much for letting us engage in this conversation about your work, and thanks to my sisters and friends for participating as well. Yeah, thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you. And you know what, Leslie, love you. I love Roseanne, Amber, all of you guys, and all of OSWAD. Y'all are my family. And I really look forward to us being together again soon, whether it is virtually and hopefully in person soon. Everybody stay safe and well, because you all are very precious in this world. And thank you all for just this opportunity. It's such an honor. It really is. And I am so touched beyond belief. So thank you again for everything.
Thank you. We love you, Kim. Thank you all.
Bye-bye, everyone.